Well, good afternoon. I think Peter introduced me when I was out of the room, and then I wasn't here earlier, and now I've come and he's out of the room. But anyway, consider me introduced a couple of hours ago. But if you weren't here then, I'm Jonathan Tame. I'm director of the Jubilee Centre in Cambridge. But more importantly than that, I'm the husband of Helen, and we have 5 children. And we lived for 11 years, a few hundred kilometres to the east of here in Romania. And so we've driven through Hungary very many times. And so my Hungarian is kind of roadside Hungarian. So Kijarat or Autobonto. Our car was always breaking down. And these are, I'm afraid, about the limits of my Hungarian, but still, I can say Köszönöm at the end. So what I want to speak about this afternoon is a relational vision for society as a Christian alternative to secular views. And the reason this is crucial is that so often what is lacking today is a framework or a vision that can really bring together all the excellent campaigns and pieces of work that we've been listening to today. And what we think is, what we want to try and present in the next half an hour is something of a fresh expression of a Christian vision for society as a whole that brings all these elements together. So let's see if we can do that. First, we need to ask the question, well, how do we understand and express the problems at the heart of Europe? And many people will address different areas, the economic problems, social problems, spiritual problems, political problems, and so on. But if you are a doctor, then the cure that you propose is only as good as your diagnosis of the disease. Yeah? Now, I've got 2 pictures up there that were about very poor diagnoses. Now, the one on the left is of somebody bleeding, a doctor taking bloodletting from a patient. And for 1,800 years, right from the ancient classical civilizations until the late 19th century, it was thought that the problem when people were sick was in the blood, and so you had to let out some of their blood in order to let the disease out. We now know that is completely the opposite of what you need to do when someone is sick. And I'm afraid that is actually how George Washington, the first president of the United States, died, because he was sick and his physician let his blood out, and of course he died from weakness and so on. But the diagnosis was wrong, and therefore the cure could not be better. The other picture is from China in the 1950s, when Chairman Mao, as part of the Cultural Revolution then, said, right, the sparrows in China are eating too much of the rice, let's all go and kill sparrows. And so there was a huge campaign to kill sparrows, because they were perceived as being the source of the problem of a shortage of food. About 6 months later, the sparrow population in large parts of China had gone down to next to nothing. And amazingly, a whole load of new pests arrived to eat the crop of rice in the field. But because, of course, the sparrows were eating the small insects that would otherwise attack the rice crop. So you've got these examples where if you get if you get the diagnosis of the problem wrong, then your prescription is likely to make things worse. So, a culture's worldview, the way it understands the world, what's wrong with the world, and so on, is going to influence the kind of solutions it proposes. And I want us to have a quick look at the Western world's priorities and values. And really, the title of this talk is a Christian Alternative to Secularist Views. And I just want to put up 2 very major secular views. One is about the economy. It's all about growth. Right now, most elections in Europe, the number one topic is about getting the economy going again. It's about jobs, it's about income, it's about finance. And so it's a complex situation, but we are addicted to debt. The debt mountain that is threatening to crush European economies is not going to go away. And in fact, European governments are largely addicted to debt. We have to borrow and spend. I mean, the extraordinary situation in the States this week was of the US government having to, going right up to the very edge before they could borrow money again to pay off their debts and to continue their expenditure. We are completely addicted to debt. And we don't know how to run our economies without debt. And therefore, growth is the only solution to that. It's growth at all costs. And what we're finding more and more is decisions are made purely on the basis of will it help growth. So the debate in France right now is about Sunday trading. Should we liberalize trading on Sundays, business working on Sundays? We must do it because it may give some advantage to economic growth. So much of the debate is around growth at all costs, because without growth we cannot pay our debts and we'll be crushed under it. And of course the other huge view that we've looked at a lot today is about individual liberty, autonomous liberty, and which we've discussed. So I want to just say, what can we say as a radical and yet deeply Christian alternative to these two compelling secular views about economic growth at all costs and individual liberty and autonomy at all costs? What does a Christian response look like? I want to introduce you to a framework created by Dale Keane and expressed in this book here. Dale is his picture there. He was one of the only ordained politics professors in the United States. Quite a rare breed if you're a professor of politics and you're an ordained Christian minister. And he was in the state of, he was at St. Anselm's College in New Hampshire, and in the US electoral system, the first primaries for the presidential elections take place in New Hampshire, and so Dale used to interview all the presidential candidates for both parties. And so he was absolutely at the forefront of understanding what's happening in American politics. But he also is a deeply reflective Christian. And his book, Sex and the I World, I highly recommend because he unpacks these three worlds. The first world, he says, before the 1960s, really up until the 50s, most nations, most cultures were living in what can be called the T world, the traditional world, of stable family life, of stable social structures by and large, until the kind of revolutions kicked off that Leo was talking about this morning. We, since the 1960s, have been living in the I world. It's called the I world because we have iPads, iPhones, iPods, and so on. Steve Jobs of Apple, he captured the spirit of individualism by putting an I in front of his technology. And that is very much the spirit of this age. It's one of autonomous freedom. And so how do we respond as Christians? Do we need to create or promote a C world, a Christian world? Dale says, no, there's something more appropriate for our 21st century society, and that is called the R world, the R for relationships. And what I'm going to talk about now for the next number of minutes is about that alternative. But just briefly, to recap, the heart of the I world, because we have to understand where we are right now in our European and Western societies. The main narrative, the main story of this I world is freedom, but freedom defined as a freedom from, not a freedom for. It's not a freedom to do right, it's a freedom from any and every restriction on what we want to do. So a freedom from nature, freedom from authority, a freedom from waiting, hence our addiction to debt at a personal level. We want to buy things today before we've earned the money for them, hence the personal debt crisis that many people are in. Secondly, fulfillment, to be myself, to find myself, to create myself. The idea is that only you can determine who you really are and what will fulfill you. This, in the end, is destructive, because we were made, as I'll go on to say, we were created by a relational God to be relational beings, and our identity is not found by us alone. Our identity is found in our relationships. Dale says in his book, there's only 3 taboos, there's only 3 things now, really, in our Western culture which are absolutely wrong. Just 3 things. One is criticizing someone else's behavior. The second taboo is to coerce, to force people to do things or to cause any harm, as defined within this framework. And thirdly, sex without mutual consent. So he says those are the only 3 things, really, which are taboo, which we don't do. But anything else goes. That is what the I world, he says, has boiled down to, these 3 taboos. And of course, this I world is unsustainable. And what it leads to is an incredible sense of insecurity and a lack of trust. Society cannot function unless we trust one another. But this I world separates us from each other more and more and more, and we become less and less trusting. And you see that at all kinds of levels, at the individual level. And distrust is always in the context of relationships. You know, you don't trust people of another language group. You don't trust people of the other sex. You don't trust people of a different generation. You don't trust people who are of a different subculture. And of course, loneliness and isolation are huge. Individualism leads to isolation and loneliness. Oh, there's the picture of the iPod. What we believe is needed is a Copernican revolution. Now, Copernicus was the Polish astronomer who in, I think, 1542, on his deathbed, published what he had been thinking about for the last 40 years. And he said, if we really want to make sense of the movement of the stars and the planets in the sky, then we need to change around the way we think the solar system is created. Well, it wasn't the solar system then. It was believed that the Earth was at the center of the system, and the planets and the sun revolved around the Earth. And he said, no, we need something else in the center. Well, Copernicus said, we need to understand it's the sun that's at the very center of the universe. And once we see, of this solar system, and once we put the sun in the center, then what we observe out there makes more sense. We believe that a proper Christian understanding of life is that relationships, that's what the R is for in that picture, relationships are really what lies at the center of human life and at the center of our meaning and purpose as human beings. And all those other things, like economics and finance and possessions and lifestyle, they should serve relationships and not the other way around. So there is a radical alternative way of life, which I think the gospel points towards. And this reflects the verse in the scriptures where Paul was writing to the Romans and saying, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, by thinking differently. Change your thinking. Metanoia is the word in Greek. To be transformed by the renewing of our minds. So Dale talks about the R world as the way forward. We cannot turn the clock back to the T world as the way out of this I world and its dead end, the dead end of individualism. And we need to have an alternative that is focused in the future, and it's the R world, the relational world. Well, how do we get to that relational world? Well, we need to begin by thinking relationally. And this concept, what we'll talk about, relational thinking, is seeking to transform society by getting our relationships right first of all. And just two preliminary things to say. Firstly, that we need to learn to see all of life as relational. And when we say that, it's not just our relationships within our own domestic and family arrangements. It's to learn to see our financial transactions as relational, borrowing and lending money as being about that relationship between those with capital and those borrowing it. We need to learn to see our relationships in the workplace or our work itself in terms of its relationships. We need to see how trust and relationships are crucial to all aspects of public life. And yes, it's not, when we talk about thinking relationally and putting relationships first, it's not just our interpersonal, especially not the boy meets girl kind of relationship, but it's between individuals and groups and organizations as well. And I want to suggest that this concept of relational thinking has at least three dimensions: theological, philosophical, and societal. So just theologically, because this whole concept and understanding of relational thinking has come from an understanding of the Bible and the understanding of Christianity as being a religion more than any other religion that's focused on relationships. If you look at any other world religion, you will not see it made up almost entirely of relationships. So think about it. God, in the Christian understanding, is Trinity. Three persons in complete unity who are one. So before the physical universe came into existence, there was relationship and love in God. Therefore, before the world began, there was relationship and there was love. That's why ultimate reality is relational. It's not material, it's not matter, it's relationship. And therefore, creation reflects that relational reality. Human beings are made in the image of a relational God, and therefore we find our meaning and our purpose and our identity in relationships. Sin and the fall are about the breaking of relationship. Sin ultimately is about saying, I can be like God. And that's actually where individualism, autonomous individualism, leads to. It says, no, I am God of my little universe. That's where individualism takes us. But when we were not created to be autonomous, we were created to be dependent on one another. Interdependent is the best word. And so if we try and absolutize a human being, that's why individualism, when you put ism on the end of a word in English, you are making it into some kind of absolute, something that determines other things. So if we put the individual human being at the center of his or her own universe, you will destroy that person. If you absolutize anything other than God, who is the source of all things, of all life, you'll end up destroying it. So individualism ends up destroying individuals, because we were not made to be like God. We were instead made for relationship with God and with others. And so on. So the covenant in the relationship between God and the nation of Israel the covenant is relational. The incarnation, God, the second person of the Trinity, becoming a human being, was a relational event. The crucifixion and the atonement was to put right our relationship with God and with one another. Eternal life, said Jesus in John's Gospel, he said, eternal life is this, that they might know me and the Father who has sent me. It's defined in terms of relationships. And the church, of course, should be, the body of Christ should be the supreme example of how to live relationally. So, theologically, this relational thinking comes from the conviction that Christianity is all about relationship. Philosophically, relational thinking gives us an antidote to toxic individualism. And that is why it's so powerful. As I've just mentioned, our personal identity and meaning is found in our relationships. It's not found in our independence from others, but in our relationships with others. And our individuality is not weakened or made any less by recognizing our interdependence. See, individualism tends to kind of take one part of our lifespan and say that is how we should all be. And that is when you are of an age when you're healthy, when you are strong, where you are independent, and you don't need other people. And it's saying all of life should be like that. But actually, when you look at the whole span of a human life, from conception to death, you'll find that we all go through different phases of depending on others and being independent, and then supporting others. We are made for this flow, like the seasons or the tides come and go, to depend on others, to be depended on. Our relationships are found and developed around this interdependence at different stages in our lives. So it's an antidote, I won't go any more into individualism because we've covered it so much today, but it's also a correction to consumerism, because if we put relationships at the heart of things, then our spending, the way we use money, our engagement with the material world, we can think about that in terms of what does this do for our relationships? Do we think about our money in terms of the way we spend it? Does it strengthen our relationships or weaken them? Does it set us apart from other people, or do we spend money to build and strengthen relationships? And here's a lovely principle that time, we all have 24 hours a day. It's the currency of relationships. Now, here's something. For an age of austerity, which is what we're living in for the next perhaps 10, 20 years or so, money is in short supply. But let me tell you what's not in short supply. Well, it is in short supply, and that is minutes and hours in a day. It is the ultimate scarce resource. You cannot ever get more than 24 hours in one day. Okay? But the amazing thing is, whilst there are huge differences in income, and this is one of the major problems we're seeing economically, is that in this age of austerity in Europe and in the Western world, we're seeing the extremes of income between rich and poor get worse and worse. So while most people are right now not seeing any increase in their material standard of living, the richest in society are getting paid more and more and more. So in this age of austerity, and that of course creates huge tensions in society, but we all have 24 hours in a day, and if time is the currency of relationship, if we use our time to build relationships, not just to please ourselves, then actually we can become more wealthy relationally. We can build what's called a relational capital by the way we invest our time. And I think this is something that this framework, this relational framework, gives us. It's the possibility to think about a different kind of wealth. It's not an economic wealth, it's a relational wealth. And whilst an awful lot of people are going to be excluded from material wealth, we are all, the richest person materially and the poorest person materially, all have the same 24 hours a day. I think God is drawing our attention to this fact, that we can learn to think relationally about what really is worth investing in, and how we use our time is all about that. So, and then finally, the third area, societally. In terms of our society, what does this relational thinking offer? Well, it's a way of ordering our lives at the personal level. As I talked about, the way we spend our time, the way we spend our money. But it's a way of thinking about technology. For example, do we use technology to strengthen and build our relationships with others, or do we use it to make us independent? These, Apple, the personal phone, we've all got one of these things. And now more and more you see people walking down the street and they're texting, they are disengaged with other people around them. Technology is so often has the result of isolating us from other people. But the same technology can also be used to build relationships. But we've got to be smart about how we use technology, and not just assume that because it's technologically possible, it's the best thing to do. We need to think relationally about technology. In an aging population, as more and more people are going to be older, as we have a greying society, how are we preparing for old age? Are we investing in a relational pension, or only in a financial pension? What's a relational pension? Well, as I was saying before, towards the end of our lives, we become more dependent on others. Are we investing in the relationships now that when we are old, we are going to have a good number of people that we can look to, that we have invested in, and that we can continue to rely on in that sense when we're older. So secondly, relational thinking operates at the level of organizations, and I'll talk about a few in a minute. Putting relationships at the heart of organizations mean that the goals of an organization can change, the values, the working practices. We can put relationships first, and as I say, I'll give some examples, but we need to think about whether it's the company we work for, whether it's the political party that we belong to, whether it's the church where we're a member. We need to think about what is the ultimate goal? How do we define the goal of this organization? Is it in material terms? Is it in terms of power? What's it about? Can we think relationally about the goals and purpose of our organizations? Lastly, right at the level of national vision and public policy, relational thinking creates an alternative framework to capitalism and statism. And that's actually where this idea came from. In the 1970s, relational thinking is a very old idea, but through the Jubilee Centre we've been articulating it in a fresh way in the last few years. And the founder is called Michael Schluter, and he was an economist working in East Africa with the World Bank and the International Food Policy Research Institute. And in the 1970s, Kenya had a capitalist economic system. To the north, Ethiopia had a Marxist government, and to the south, Tanzania had a socialist view. Three completely different views of what is national development and life about. And in the Nairobi Baptist Church, Christians would come and they would say, now, how do we respond to these three very different ideals for what society is about? Do we just critique those ideologies, or is there a real Christian alternative? And that was the question which Michael Schluter sensed God was calling him to give his life to find a biblical alternative, or to understand the biblical alternative to capitalism, socialism, Marxism, and so on. And that search took him to the model of ancient Israel in the Bible, where Israel was shaped by the body of laws which God gave through Moses. If you think of the history of Israel, and when they were given that law, it was after hundreds of years of slavery in another land. They came out of Egypt as slaves with no institutions whatsoever. They escaped with just what they could carry. And to that group of refugees, God gave his law. And that law covered all kinds of areas of society and of life. And so you see the biblical law touching on relationships within the family. It involves relationships between neighbours, between the rich and the poor, between borrowers and lenders, between foreigners and nationals. All sorts of dimensions of people and of relationships were covered in that law. But Michael Schluter was saying, now how does that apply in 20th century Africa? And so he was looking for the key, the hermeneutical key, to take from that rich tradition that was 3,000 years old and applied, it seems, or was given in the context of a pre-industrial agrarian society in the Middle East. How did that apply today, was his question. He looked for the hermeneutical key, and this is what he found. He realized the question was asked of Jesus by some people at the time, the Pharisees, saying, he said, they came up to him and said, well, what is the greatest commandment in the law? There are 613 laws in the Old Testament. That's an awful lot of things you have to try and remember, to try and keep. So how do we make sense of those? And so Jesus said, look, the greatest commandment is this, to love God with all your heart, and secondly, to love your neighbour as yourself. He would not give the one. He said the two cannot be separated. You cannot love God without loving your neighbour. And then he said this, he gave this throwaway line. He said, on these two commands hang all the law and the prophets. Meaning that all those 613 laws are really ultimately all about loving God and loving neighbour. And therefore love, which is a quality of relationship, is what the law is all about. So we tend to think very negatively about the law in the Bible. We think it's about, you shall not do this, you shall not do that, you shall not do the other. Whereas in fact, God's intentions and purposes was to give his law to this nation of Israel, to be a model nation, to demonstrate how actually to live a life of love in all areas of life. And so that's where theologically relational thinking has its roots, in understanding that's what the law is all about. And so as we are seeking to think relationally today, it's by drawing from that rich tradition and teaching from the Bible about all kinds of relationships. Now, I'll jump to something completely different here, and that is to say, relational thinking is not just a vague sense of, hey, let's put relationships at the heart of what we seek and what we're doing. It also is very practical. And because relational thinking, it's not enough going around saying, hey, we need to be nicer to each other. We need to be kind, just be more loving. You cannot, in a sinful world, you can't just tell people to be nice. It doesn't work. But what can you do? You can influence, through public policy or an organization's policy, you can influence the environment in which relationships grow. And so there is a model here that we've developed in Cambridge, which we call the relational proximity framework, and it looks into 5 dimensions of any relationship. And there is, just very briefly, I don't want to go into the detail of this because it's in one of the books out on the bookshelf at the back, on the table out where we're having our breaks, and that's called the Relational Manager. And this chart is taken from that book. And it shows these 5 different dimensions. One is the dimension of communication, and it's about how do we communicate and what, how direct is that. Secondly is the element of time. Over time, how are we relating? What do we do? What happens in a relationship in between the times when people meet? And in the public life, in terms of delivering public services, this is crucially important, because often what is happening in welfare provision is that the staff of the government agency, the welfare agency, keeps changing. And so a certain family in need are going to find every few months that the person they're relating to changes, and they have to begin their story all over again. And so there's a real cost relationally if there's not continuity. Thirdly, there's how well do we know each other in a relationship? We call that multiplexity. Do we really know what makes the other person tick? So often we relate to people in public life according to their function. What is that person's job? What are they supposed to do? And we relate accordingly. But behind that function or that job is a human being, is a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, a brother or sister, someone who's got somebody at home who's very sick, or someone who's maybe just had a loss in their life, or someone who's anxious, has just been diagnosed with a terminal illness perhaps. We don't know what's going on behind that face, but multiplexity is the sense of getting to know other people and what is going on in their lives so that that relationship can be more effective. The 4th dimension is about power and how power is used in relationships. How fair, how equal is that? It's not actually seeking equality, but rather an equality of respect, mutual respect in that relationship. So we're looking for what's called parity, where the managing director of a company and the person who cleans his office, even though in every other way they're hugely different, they may actually have children of the same age. They may be able to talk as parents together. There's a sense of parity there. Looking for that, how can we build that in relationships? And the final dimension is around purpose. What's the goal or purpose of this relationship? And is there enough common goal or common purpose for a relationship to be built? Let me finish with giving you 4 examples of application. One is in business. Thinking relationally in the business world. It's starting to happen. We talk now more and more about triple bottom line reporting. Big companies have to report about their financial performance, their environmental impact, and increasingly their social impact. But the question is, how do you measure the social impact of a company? And that's where we've been developing a whole range of tools where companies can measure the quality of relationships between all the stakeholders in that company. This relational thinking it's not just an ideology, it's not just a way of thinking about the world, a worldview, it's also about something very, very practical which can be taken into businesses and companies. And there's a relational business charter that we've written as well to try and help companies to kind of work out this Copernican revolution for themselves, putting relationships at the heart of what their business is about. What about education and schools? What is education for? In the Western world, we tend to think of educating children for their future earning potential, and that's about it. You develop their skills and abilities so they can get a job and earn money. What about our education being also for relationships? How about changing the vision and the goals of schools, not just individual achievement, but also relational maturity, participation, responsibility? Are we teaching kids how to take responsibility for others? And if that's the case, do we need to rethink the values, the working practices and the actual relationships that are going on in schools? Are we modelling good relationships in our schools? Are we trying to? Are we seeking to? And then can relational skills be brought into the curriculum more and more? Teaching kids how to work together, how to relate together. It's very interesting in Britain that there are a lot of migrant workers from the former communist countries in Europe. And there was there was criticism about this because young English kids were not getting jobs and they were being given to Poles or Hungarians or Romanians, and the employers would be asked, well, why don't you employ the English people? They've got qualifications, they've got left school with the appropriate qualifications, and so often they'd say, well, yeah, but they are not relationally as mature as people coming from Eastern Europe. They know how to speak to other people, how to relate face to face. They're polite, they're on time, they work hard, they have a different relational ethic. And so you see these real differences, that it's a huge advantage to a business if people are being relationally educated, not just technically educated. So, and there's a relational schools project which we're going to start next year to try and pilot this idea in Britain, maybe in these 3 or 4 countries, the States, Netherlands and Singapore. How about poverty? How do we think about poverty? And how do we measure wealth or poverty? Is it material poverty only? Do we measure poverty just in terms of income per head? Or are we paying proper attention to the other kinds and categories of poverty, especially around relationships? And the studies of well-being all show that above a certain level of income, people's happiness is no longer correlated to the increased income. So it's no good thinking that the more and more wealth, average income per head is going to lead to more and more happiness. It just doesn't happen. Instead, here's the challenge. It's much easier to find someone who is financially rich and miserable than to find someone who is relationally rich and miserable. So what kind of wealth are we building in society? And so poverty and wealth should not just be looked at in financial terms, but in relational terms as well. So running out of time, just criminal justice. What is the nature of crime? I don't know how the criminal justice system is here, but in Britain, crime is usually seen as a problem between the criminal and the state. And the state will then prosecute the alleged criminal on behalf of the victim. But actually, a crime is firstly a violation between the criminal and the victim. And what is being done about that relationship? And so there's a whole notion of relational justice or restorative justice which sees crime through that relational lens and seeks to restore those broken relationships. And that has been really successful where it's been piloted. By seeing justice as about restoring relationships between both offenders and victims, and between offenders and the community. So they're no longer seen. There's got to be a way back, a way that someone can be restored to the community after they've committed an offence. If no one was restored, well, if that was the case with us and God when we sin, then there would be no one at all in God's family if there wasn't a way back, if there wasn't a way of restoration. And so we need to think in terms of our criminal justice system in the same way. And so, to conclude, what can we do to build a new relational vision of Europe? And I'm doing a book review unashamedly because I don't want to carry these back again. I know several of you have not got earphones on, which means you understand English, or else you're completely zoned out at the end of a long day. But if you're interested in the books here, this is the Jubilee Manifesto. We've written a framework, agenda and strategy for Christian social reform. That's the long version. Here's the short version, just 36 pages long, a Jubilee roadmap, which really takes this relational concept from the Bible, the model in the Bible, all the way to contemporary 21st century society, and shows us how we can draw from this incredible timeless wisdom from God's word in the Bible and apply it to our contemporary society in a way that's relational, holistic and sustainable. After Capitalism is the book that ECPF sponsored, and that is a compilation of the Cambridge papers, which I've got copies, and these are free if you want to take some. The latest one is called Infinite Choice, and is absolutely getting to the heart of individualism today, where we've come to the point where we're saying the thing that gives value to anything is that someone has chosen it. It doesn't matter what the intrinsic good or value of the choice is. It's the fact that someone chooses it that's the only thing that gives it value. And it shows how completely inconsistent that is, and how destructive it is. And lastly, the book I already held up, Sex and the I World, which explains the T world, the I world, and the alternative relational world that we can work towards. So these are the books I have, and they'll be for sale, and those blue Cambridge papers are free if you want to take one, or if you want to ask any questions afterwards. So thank you very much.